Jonathan Reeves sat in his glass-walled office, the city sprawling beneath him in a sea of flickering neon and restless headlights. He had built his empire from the ground up, transforming a single mom-and-pop diner into Reeves Family Diners, a nationwide chain that once prided itself on home-cooked meals and warm hospitality. But something had changed. Sales were down. Customer complaints had surged. His regional managers swore everything was under control, but a nagging instinct told him otherwise. Then, an anonymous email landed in his inbox. "Your empire is rotting from the inside. Come see for yourself." No signature. No details. Just a dare. He dismissed it at first. A disgruntled employee, maybe. Or a competitor stirring trouble. But the words clung to him, unraveling memories of the diner's early days, the long shifts, the friendships forged over coffee-stained counters, the promise he had made to always take care of the people who took care of his business. Now, that promise felt distant. The decision came swiftly. He wouldn't send investigators, wouldn't alert corporate. If something was truly wrong, he needed to see it with his own eyes. And the only way to do that was from the ground level. By morning, Jonathan Reeves ceased to exist. He stood before the bathroom mirror, razor in hand, watching dark bristles fall into the sink. Without his neatly trimmed beard and slick back hair, the polished CEO vanished, leaving behind someone else, someone anonymous. He traded tailored suits for a faded hoodie, ripped jeans, and scuffed sneakers. A pair of wire rim glasses completed the transformation, dulling the sharpness of his gaze. He became Jack Ryan, an unemployed drifter looking for work. By noon, he walked into one of his first-ever locations, the Maplewood Reeves Diner. The moment he stepped inside, the stench of burnt grease hit him. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over cracked vinyl booths and a sticky linoleum floor. This place used to hum with life. Now it felt tired. At the front counter, two cashiers juggled impatient customers, while an overworked waitress hurried between tables, her notepad slipping from her grip. The man behind the kitchen window, a burly cook in a grease-stained apron, scrolled through his phone, ignoring the backlog of orders. Then came the voice, low, gruff, and smothered in forced politeness. "Help you?" Jonathan turned toward the manager. Carl, mid-40s, thinning hair, wearing a polo with the company logo, stretched too tight across his belly. His name tag was smeared, as if no one had bothered to clean it for months. Jonathan kept his voice even. "I heard you were hiring." Carl gave him a slow, skeptical once-over, eyes flicking from his cheap clothes to his scuffed shoes. "You got experience?" "Yeah. Kitchen work, cleaning. Whatever's needed." Carl smirked. "Yeah? You got a criminal record?" Jonathan blinked. "What?" Carl leaned in, lowering his voice. "Look, buddy, I don't care where you've been or what you've done. I just need warm bodies to fill shifts. But you screw around and you're out. Minimum wage. No overtime. No breaks if we're busy. That a problem?" Jonathan shook his head. "Good," Carl grunted. "You start now." And just like that, Jonathan, the multimillionaire CEO, was handed a mop. He spent the first few hours watching. The diner wasn't just mismanaged, it was on the verge of collapse. Orders were wrong more often than right. Food went cold under the heat lamps. Customers walked out before being served. The few employees who actually cared were drowning in the chaos. And then there were the cashiers. Lisa, early 20s, dark circles under her eyes, worked the register like a machine, barely looking up. Next to her was Hannah, slightly older, moving stiffly as though her entire body ached. They barely spoke, exchanging only exhausted nods and murmured warnings about impatient customers. Jonathan noticed something else, too. Carl hovered around them too often. Whenever Lisa adjusted her headset or turned away, his hand lingered too long on her shoulder. When Hannah bent to grab something from beneath the counter, his gaze followed. Jonathan's grip tightened around the mop handle. An hour later, during a lull, he found himself in the back room, grabbing a new mop head when he overheard whispers. "Lisa, I don't care anymore. If he touches me again, I'm quitting. I don't care how bad I need the money." Hannah's voice came softer, urgent. Lisa, don't. You know what happens when you push back. Jonathan stopped cold. A slow, burning rage curled in his chest. This wasn't just neglect. This was something much worse. And now he knew why he was here. Jonathan worked in silence, hands raw from scrubbing grease-caked floors and scraping dried food from the underside of tables. His body ached in ways it hadn't in years, but his mind stayed sharp, cataloging every sign of decay. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was rot. The kitchen ran on apathy. The head cook, Dale, barely lifted his eyes from his phone unless it was to bark orders at the younger employees. He dumped frozen patties onto the griddle with no care for quality, let toast burn until it blackened, and sent out undercooked eggs without a second glance. The health inspector hadn't been here in a while, or if they had, they'd been paid to look the other way. At the register, Lisa and Hannah bore the weight of the entire front end. They handled complaints, late orders, wrong meals, angry customers, all while working under Carl's watchful eye. Jonathan noticed how often Lisa flinched when Carl spoke, how Hannah kept her head down, moving stiffly, as if any sudden motion might draw his attention. They were afraid of him. It took only 2 days for Jonathan to see that Carl ran this diner like his own personal kingdom. He stole from a register, his thick fingers swiping loose bills when he thought no one was looking. He skimmed tips, laughing about it later like it was a game. But the worst was how he used his authority to control and intimidate. Jonathan overheard a conversation between Dale and Carl during a slow stretch in the afternoon. "You keep Lisa late again last night?" Dale asked, leaning against the counter, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag so filthy it left more grease behind than it cleaned. Carl smirked. She didn't complain. Jonathan, stacking clean trays nearby, felt his stomach turn. Dale snorted. "You're gonna push your luck with that one. She's got fire." Carl shrugged. "Fire burns out when you don't give it air." Something inside Jonathan snapped, but he forced himself to stay quiet, to stay calculated. Blowing his cover now wouldn't help anyone. That night, as he took out the garbage, he saw Hannah sitting behind the diner, her back against the brick wall, knees pulled to her chest. The glow of her phone screen lit her face, but her eyes were unfocused. Jonathan hesitated, then stepped closer. "You okay?" She flinched, stuffing her phone into her pocket and wiping quickly at her face. "Fine." She wasn't. He crouched beside her, picking at a loose thread on his hoodie sleeve. "I've been here 2 days, and I already know Carl's a bastard." A bitter laugh escaped her, but she didn't deny it. He pressed on, keeping his voice even. "Lisa said something about him crossing a line." Hannah tensed. She shouldn't have said anything. She's scared. We all are. Jonathan let the words settle. The night air was thick with the scent of old fryer oil and cigarette smoke drifting from Dale's car across the lot. "How long has it been like this?" he asked. Hannah exhaled slowly, pressing the heels of her palms to her eyes. "Too long." She told him about the pay cuts that weren't official but just happened. The hours shaved off their paychecks, the way Carl could make a shift unbearable for anyone who questioned him. And then there were the other things, the things Hannah wouldn't say out loud, but Jonathan could read in the way her voice wavered, the way she refused to meet his eyes. Lisa wasn't the only one Carl had tried to control. Jonathan's blood ran cold. He had seen corrupt managers before, lazy, incompetent, even self-serving. But Carl was something else. A predator wrapped in authority, protected by fear. The next morning, Jonathan came in early and checked the timesheets. The numbers didn't add up. Hundreds of dollars missing from the payroll, hours erased, shifts manipulated. He wasn't just robbing the register. He was stealing from his own employees. By noon, Jonathan had made up his mind. He wasn't here just to observe anymore. It was time to act. Jonathan moved through the diner with a quiet purpose, blending into the background as Carl strutted around like a king surveying his crumbling kingdom. The tension among the employees was thick, an invisible force pressing down on the air, making every shift feel heavier than the last. Lisa barely spoke anymore. Her hands trembled when she counted change at the register, her jaw tight whenever Carl hovered too close. Hannah kept her head down. Her usual weary acceptance sharpened into something more like fear. Jonathan had seen enough. Late that evening, after the last customers dragged themselves out and Dale slunk off to his car, Jonathan made his way to the back office. The door was locked, but that didn't matter. The lock was cheap, the kind that popped open with the right amount of pressure and a well-angled push. The office reeked of old coffee and sweat. Piles of crumpled receipts littered the desk, sticky with spilled soda. A row of security monitors flickered in the dim light, their grainy footage capturing every inch of the diner. Jonathan's stomach turned as he realized Carl had a clear view of everything: the register, the kitchen, even the break room. The safe was open. Stacks of cash sat inside, but Jonathan wasn't interested in that. He pulled out a manila folder, flipping through payroll logs that had been doctored so obviously it was insulting. Missing hours, slashed wages, forged signatures. He snapped a quick picture of each page with his phone. A low chuckle behind him sent ice through his veins. "You lost, my boy." Jonathan turned slowly. Carl leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, his mouth twisted into a smug smirk. Jonathan kept his expression blank. Door was open. Carl stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You got a lot of nerve poking around where you don't belong." For the first time in weeks, Jonathan wanted to drop the act. Wanted to rip the name tag off his shirt and tell Carl exactly who he was and how fast he was about to lose everything. But he held back. Not yet. Instead, he shrugged. "Just cleaning up." Carl's eyes flicked to the safe. Something shifted in his expression, something dark. "See, I don't think that's true." Jonathan said nothing. Carl stepped closer, his breath thick with the stench of cheap cigars and fried food. "You think you're smart, don't you?" He clapped a heavy hand on Jonathan's shoulder, fingers tightening like a vice. "You're not." Jonathan stared at him, unmoving. Carl's grip tightened. "Stay in your lane, or you won't like what happens next." Jonathan let the silence stretch, let the weight of it sink in. Then, finally, he smiled. Just enough to unnerve. Just enough to let Carl know he wasn't afraid. Carl released him with a shove. "Get out." Jonathan walked past him without a word, but inside, his pulse roared. Carl had just made his last mistake. The next day, Hannah didn't show up for work. Lisa arrived late, her face pale, her eyes darting around like she expected something, or someone, to come after her. Jonathan pulled her aside near the storage shelves, keeping his voice low. "Where's Hannah?" Lisa swallowed hard. "She quit." Jonathan's stomach dropped. "What?" Lisa's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Carl cut her hours again. Told her if she didn't like it, she could leave." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "And after last night," Jonathan didn't need to hear the rest. That was it. That was the breaking point. That night, while Carl counted out the registers and Dale chattered on about some fight he watched on TV, Jonathan pulled Lisa aside. "I need your help." She blinked, wary. "With what?" He pulled out his phone, scrolling through the pictures of the forged payroll records. "I have proof." Her breath hitched. "You." "I just need one last piece." He glanced toward the office. "If I can catch him stealing from the safe, it's over." Lisa hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. An hour later, Carl wandered into the office, grumbling under his breath about lazy workers and people who don't know their place. He didn't know Jonathan had set up a phone on the shelf, camera rolling. Didn't know Lisa stood outside the door, listening. Didn't know his empire was already crumbling beneath him. And when he opened the safe, stuffing loose bills into his pocket, Jonathan caught every second of it. He turned to leave and froze. Lisa stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes blazing. Carl sneered. "What the hell are you looking at?" She didn't flinch, didn't back down. For the first time, she stood tall. "You," she said. Jonathan stepped forward. "We both are." Carl's sneer faded. For the first time, he looked afraid. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at the diner just as the doors opened. But this time, he wasn't alone. A group of corporate auditors stepped in behind him, their crisp suits and sharp gazes slicing through the stale air of grease and neglect. They moved with quiet efficiency, spreading out, scanning the space with practiced scrutiny. Employees froze, spatulas hovering over griddles, coffee cups held mid-pour. Carl, still half asleep, blinked at the unfamiliar faces before his eyes landed on Jonathan. He squinted, confused at first, then irritated. "What the hell is this?" Jonathan stepped forward, his posture no longer that of an exhausted new hire, no longer small, no longer meek. His voice carried weight. "This is an audit." Carl scoffed. "An audit? Says who?" Jonathan removed his name tag, the cheap plastic clicking against the counter. He smoothed his wrinkled uniform shirt and leveled his gaze at the man who had been running his diner into the ground. Then he said it. "Says me." Recognition dawned in Carl's eyes, first disbelief, then horror. His mouth opened, then shut, as if he couldn't quite force a response past his thick throat. The room was silent, save for the hum of the ancient ceiling fan and the distant clatter of a dish in the sink. Lisa, standing behind the register, let out a slow breath, her hands gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Dale, usually indifferent, shifted uncomfortably by the griddle. Even the handful of customers in the booths sensed something monumental was unfolding. Jonathan let the silence drag, let the weight of the moment sink in. Then, in a voice calm but edged with steel, he spoke again. "I own this diner. And you're done." Carl let out a hollow laugh, the sound brittle. You're full of shit." But his bravado cracked. His hands twitched at his sides, his eyes darting toward the office, toward the safe. Jonathan pulled out his phone and hit play. The video filled the room, Carl, standing at the safe, stuffing cash into his pockets, muttering to himself about idiot workers and corporate never noticing. Lisa watched, her expression unreadable, but there was something sharp in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Dale turned away. Carl's face darkened, his hands curling into fists. This doesn't mean anything." His voice wavered. "You don't have proof of anything else." Jonathan's lips barely moved. "I have payroll logs, security footage, witness statements." He glanced at Lisa, "and people who are finally willing to talk." Carl took a step back, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. One of the auditors, a woman with short blonde hair and a no-nonsense stare, pulled out a folder. "Mr. Reeves, would you like us to proceed with filing formal charges for payroll fraud and theft?" Carl's face turned a sickly shade of gray. Jonathan tilted his head. "What do you think, Carl?" The silence stretched. Carl turned, as if considering bolting for the back exit, but two uniformed police officers stepped into the diner, their presence heavy with inevitability. Lisa straightened. "Hannah," who had returned after Jonathan had called her personally, lifted her chin. The other employees, once afraid, watched without fear. Carl exhaled sharply, a bitter, defeated sound. Then, without another word, he dropped his name tag onto the floor and let the officers take him by the arms. As they led him out, Jonathan turned back to the employees. For the first time, they weren't looking at the floor. Later that night, long after corporate had gone, after the police reports were filed and Carl was just a bad memory, Jonathan sat in one of the cracked vinyl booths. The diner felt different, lighter. Lisa placed a cup of coffee in front of him, steam curling into the air. "On the house," she said. Jonathan smiled. For the first time in a long time, this place felt like home again.